He laughed at karma until it knocked on his door. In a world that moves so fast, truth often walks slowly, but it always arrives. I want you to imagine a man standing in his corner office on the 47th floor, looking down at the city like a king surveying his kingdom. He's built an empire by stepping on others, by cutting corners, by believing that consequences are for the weak, and karma is just a fairy tale that poor people tell themselves to feel better about their failures. This man's name was Marcus Chen, and 3 years ago I watched him laugh, actually laugh, when someone mentioned that his ruthless business practices might catch up with him someday. "Karma," he said, swirling his expensive whiskey. "That's just something losers invented to explain why they're not winners." He had no idea that across the city, in a small apartment, lit only by candlelight, an elderly woman he had destroyed was sitting in meditation, not cursing him, not plotting revenge, but simply holding space for truth to unfold. She understood something Marcus didn't, that karma isn't punishment delivered by an angry universe, it's the natural consequence of choices, as inevitable as gravity, as patient as time itself. Let me tell you what really happened. Marcus Chen was the kind of man who measured his worth by other people's losses. By age 35, he had built Chen Industries into a real estate empire worth over $200 million, and he had done it by perfecting the art of legal cruelty. He specialized in buying run-down apartment buildings in low-income neighborhoods, then finding loopholes to evict long-term tenants so he could renovate and triple the rent. The elderly woman I mentioned was named Rose Martinez. She had lived in the same small apartment for 37 years, raising her children there after her husband died young, watching grandchildren take their first steps on those worn wooden floors. When Marcus bought her building, she was 78 years old, living on a fixed income, with nowhere else to go. Marcus could have worked with her. He could have offered her a fair relocation package. Instead, he chose efficiency over empathy. He had his lawyers find a technicality in her lease, filed for eviction, and when she tried to fight it, he buried her in legal fees she couldn't afford. She lost her apartment, her security deposit, and most of her savings to attorney costs. The last time Marcus saw Rose, she was loading her few remaining possessions into her nephew's truck. He happened to be walking past the building that day, checking on the renovation progress. Their eyes met for just a moment. Marcus expected to see hatred, anger, the kind of resentment that would justify his low opinion of people who couldn't handle the real world. Instead, Rose looked at him with something that unsettled him far more than anger would have. A deep, sorrowful compassion. "I forgive you," she said quietly, "but forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. What you're planting, you'll harvest. That's not a curse. That's just how the garden grows." Marcus laughed that night, telling the story to his friends at the country club. "Can you believe it? She's talking about karma like it's gardening. These people and their superstitions." His friends laughed too, but something about Rose's words had lodged in his mind like a splinter he couldn't dig out. The Buddha taught in the Dhammapada, "All things arise from mind. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. When the mind is impure, suffering follows like a cart trailing an ox." Marcus's mind was focused entirely on acquisition, on winning, on proving his superiority over others. He had no idea that every choice was writing the story of his future. For 2 years, Marcus continued his pattern. More buildings, more evictions, more profit. He expanded into other cities, other types of exploitation that were perfectly legal and absolutely devastating to the people affected. He felt invincible, vindicated, proof that nice guys finish last and that karma was indeed a fairy tale. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus was staying late at his office, reviewing contracts for his biggest deal yet. A plan to buy and redevelop an entire neighborhood that would displace nearly 400 families. He had been working for 18 hours straight, fueled by ambition and amphetamines, when exhaustion finally forced him to rest his head on his desk for just a moment. In that brief sleep, he began to dream. But this wasn't like any dream he had ever experienced. It felt more real than reality, more vivid than waking life. He found himself standing in what looked like a vast courtroom, but the walls were made of light, and the ceiling stretched into infinity. Before him sat not a judge, but Rose Martinez, though she appeared younger, radiant, her eyes filled with an ancient wisdom. Around the room were hundreds of other people, all the tenants he had evicted, all the families he had displaced, all the elderly people who had died in inadequate housing after he had taken their homes. "This isn't about judgment," Rose said, her voice echoing with compassion rather than condemnation. "This is about understanding. Do you want to see what you've planted?" Suddenly, Marcus was experiencing life from their perspectives. He felt what it was like to be Mrs. Chen, no relation, an 82-year-old woman with arthritis, trying to carry her belongings down 3 flights of stairs because he had turned off the elevator to force faster evacuations. He experienced the panic of Miguel Santos, a single father who had to pull his children out of school and move to a shelter because Marcus had bought their building and immediately tripled the rent. He felt the heartbreak of Rose herself, not just from losing her home, but from watching her community scatter like seeds in a hurricane, connections severed that had taken decades to build. But the most devastating part of the dream was yet to come. Marcus found himself looking into a mirror, but instead of his own reflection, he saw a chain of consequences stretching into the future. He saw his own daughter, now 3 years old, grown up and facing homelessness because of economic policies and business practices that he himself had pioneered. He saw his son, now just a baby, dying alone in a nursing home because a younger, more ruthless version of Marcus had bought the facility and cut it down to skeleton staffing to maximize profit. "Karma isn't punishment," Rose said as the vision faded. "It's simply the truth that all actions have consequences, and all consequences ripple forward through time. You've been throwing stones into the pond of existence. Now the waves are coming back to shore." Marcus woke up gasping, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might be having a heart attack. The papers for the 400 family displacement were still spread across his desk, but now they looked different to him. Each address wasn't just a number, it was a home, a history, a web of relationships that his signature would shatter. He called his assistant and told her to cancel the meeting. Then he drove through the night to the neighborhood he had been planning to destroy, and for the first time in his career, he really looked at what he was about to take away. The ancient Sanskrit word karma literally means action or deed, but its deeper meaning is about the invisible threads that connect every choice to every consequence. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a teaching that says, if you want to know your past, look at your present circumstances. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. Marcus had spent years believing that cleverness could outsmart consequence, that legal technicalities could shield him from the moral weight of his choices. But karma operates on a different timeline than human justice, and it sees through every loophole, every rationalization, every attempt to avoid responsibility. The Buddha taught that there are three kinds of karma: actions of body, speech, and mind. Marcus had focused only on ensuring his bodily actions stayed within legal boundaries, never considering that his intentions, his words, and the suffering he caused were also seeds being planted in the field of his future. But here's what Marcus learned that night, and what many people misunderstand about karma. It's not a cosmic system of punishment and reward. It's more like the law of physics applied to consciousness. When we act from greed, hatred, or ignorance, we strengthen those qualities within ourselves and create conditions that invite similar energies back into our lives. When we act from generosity, compassion, and wisdom, we cultivate those qualities and create conditions for peace and happiness. Rose Martinez understood this deeply. Even as Marcus destroyed her life, she held no hatred because she knew that hatred would only poison her own heart. Her forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate expression of spiritual strength, a refusal to let someone else's darkness dim her own light. The dream Marcus experienced wasn't supernatural intervention. It was his own consciousness finally forced to confront the weight of his choices when his usual defenses were down. In Buddhist psychology, we call this kusala and akusala, wholesome and unwholesome mental states. For years, Marcus had been cultivating unwholesome states, and they had grown so strong that they began to consume him from within. The vision of his children's suffering wasn't prophecy, it was recognition. He saw that the world he was creating through his actions was a world where his own loved ones would eventually have to live. The cruelty he normalized, the compassion he mocked, the systems of exploitation he perfected, all of it would outlast him and shape the reality his children would inherit. Have you ever noticed how the qualities you most despise in others often find a way of showing up in your own life? Do you believe that the energy we put into the world eventually returns to us, perhaps not in the form we expect, but in the lessons we most need to learn? Marcus never did sign those papers to displace the 400 families. Instead, he spent the next 3 years quietly liquidating his empire and using the profits to create a foundation that helps elderly tenants fight unfair evictions. He still thinks about Rose Martinez every day, and he finally understands what she meant about forgiveness and consequence. She had forgiven him to free herself from the burden of hatred, but the consequences of his actions, the weight in his chest, the sleepless nights, the knowledge of the pain he had caused, those were his to carry and transform. Karma hadn't punished him, it had educated him. The last time I spoke with Marcus, he told me something profound. I used to think karma was about getting what you deserve. Now I know it's about becoming what you choose. Every day, Through every action, every word, every thought, we're writing the story of who we're becoming. If this story stirred something in your heart, leave a word in the comments, even just "coach peace." Sometimes a single word from a stranger can be exactly the encouragement someone needs to choose differently. And if you're carrying the weight of choices you wish you could unmake, remember, karma isn't about being stuck with who you've been. It's about having the power to choose who you're becoming. Every moment is a new seed you can plant in the garden of your future. Subscribe if you'd like to explore more stories of transformation and awakening. Share this if you know someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose compassion over cleverness, connection over competition. Let's build a space of compassion and truth together. Karma doesn't knock on doors to punish. It knocks to awaken. And it's always, always waiting for us to answer.